I still remember that cool autumn morning as if it were etched into my memory. The day began with a crisp clarity, the kind that makes you feel that everything is exactly as it should be, even when subtle hints whisper otherwise. My name is Benjamin Cooper, and I've always taken pride in the steady, predictable rhythm of my life. I live in a quiet Midwestern town, where mornings are spent in peaceful routine and evenings in comfortable silence. That morning, as the first rays of light broke over the horizon, I awoke to the gentle sound of the wind rustling through the trees outside our modest home. I slid out of bed and made my way to the kitchen, where I found my wife, Emily, already seated at the table with a steaming cup of coffee. Her eyes sparkled with the warmth of familiarity, and for a moment, nothing seemed out of place. "Good morning, Ben," she said with a soft smile. I returned the greeting and joined her, savoring the aroma of freshly brewed coffee. As we chatted about the day ahead, our conversation was light and unhurried. Talk of the upcoming community fundraiser, plans for the weekend, and a brief mention of a new project at the local community center where she volunteered. We spoke in the comfortable cadence of two people who have shared years of routine without ever having to dig deeper into the everyday details. After breakfast, I grabbed my jacket and headed out the door for work. I work as a site manager at a construction firm, a job that demands punctuality, precision, and the steady focus of someone who thrives on routine. The drive to the site was uneventful. I followed the same well-worn path through our small town, past familiar landmarks: a red brick school, the old mill, and the town square where neighbors gathered for morning coffee. It was on one of these drives that I first noticed a detail that made me pause. As I neared the town square, I saw a figure who didn't quite blend with the usual early risers. A man in a worn, dark jacket sat on a bench near the entrance, his eyes fixed on something in the distance. There was nothing overtly alarming about his presence, just a quiet solitude that seemed out of step with the orderly pace of the town. I made a mental note, brushing it off as one more piece of the varied tapestry of life in our community. At work, I was absorbed in the usual tasks, reviewing blueprints, coordinating with contractors, and ensuring that every detail on the construction site was in order. My focus was absolute, leaving little room for distractions. Yet, occasionally, my mind wandered back to the morning image of that solitary figure. It was a fleeting thought, a mere detail among many, but it lingered at the back of my mind. By midday, the routine of my work had firmly re-established itself. I joined a brief lunch with colleagues at a nearby diner, a small establishment that had become a daily ritual. Over burgers and fries, we talked about the weather, the progress on various projects, and the simple pleasure of a well-cooked meal. I glanced around, noting the ordinary faces, each carrying the marks of a day spent working steadily through life. Nothing suggested that the day held secrets or hidden dramas. After lunch, I returned to the site, my mind slowly returning to the steady beat of work. Throughout the afternoon, I received routine phone calls, managed schedules, and inspected construction materials. My world was made of concrete plans and tangible progress. Nothing abstract or emotional, just the reliable substance of everyday tasks. When the workday finally ended, I drove home in the soft glow of the late afternoon. The streets were calm, and the setting sun painted long shadows across the sidewalks. As I pulled into our driveway, I noticed that the house looked just as it always did, a small, tidy home with a white picket fence and a garden that had seen better days. The familiar sight brought a sense of relief and comfort, reaffirming that my life was secure and predictable. Inside, the atmosphere was as warm as ever. Emily was in the living room, flipping through a magazine, her face relaxed and peaceful. We exchanged greetings, and she remarked on the pleasant day ahead. I set down my briefcase, tired but content from the day's work. The evening promised another quiet dinner and the soothing ritual of unwinding in the familiarity of our shared space. Yet, as I settled into my favorite armchair later that evening, the events of the day replayed in my mind with subtle variations. There were the small moments that didn't quite add up, like the man at the square whose presence had seemed so deliberate, or the extra envelope I had seen tucked away on our kitchen counter earlier that morning. I recalled that I had noticed it while fetching the newspaper, a piece of mail with no return address and a neat, unassuming script. I placed it aside, assuming it was nothing more than a forgotten notice about a local event. These were details that could be easily rationalized. After all, life in our town was full of coincidences and ordinary oddities. I never gave them much thought then, choosing instead to focus on the larger picture of stability and routine. The day had been uneventful in the way that truly matters. There was no crisis, no upheaval, no sign that anything was amiss. As I sipped my tea and gazed out the window at the quiet street, I felt a sense of gratitude for the simple order of my life. Every morning brought the promise of a new day, every routine action a reassurance that things were as they should be. I reflected on the consistency of our lives, how the mundane could be so profoundly comforting even when hidden currents might stir beneath the surface. Little did I know that these early moments, marked by gentle routines and subtle clues, were laying the groundwork for a revelation that would come later. In that tranquil space, I felt invincible in my certainty that everything was perfectly in its place. The quiet precision of my morning, the familiar cadence of work and home, and the unspoken promise of each new sunrise all spoke of a life untainted by unexpected surprises. For now, I chose to believe in the solidity of routine and the comfort of normalcy. I tucked away the minor details, like the mysterious envelope, the solitary figure in the square, and the slight change in Emily's tone during our brief morning chat, as nothing more than incidental notes in the background of a life that was otherwise well-ordered. That night, as I lay in bed listening to the soft hum of the house settling into sleep, I allowed myself a moment of quiet reflection. I marveled at how seamlessly the day had unfolded, every minute accounted for in the grand tapestry of routine. It was a night of peace and certainty, a night in which I believed that nothing in the world could disrupt the familiar rhythm of my existence. In the calm darkness, I felt secure, unaware of the undercurrents that would eventually force me to question everything I had taken for granted. For now, the ordinary morning was all there was, a chapter of predictable moments that promised many more to come. And so I drifted off to sleep, confident in the stability of the life I had built, unaware of the secrets that lay quietly waiting to change it all. The next few days passed with the same measured rhythm, but I couldn't help noticing small details that began to tug at the edge of my carefully maintained routine. I continued my work at the construction site, focused on deadlines and project plans, yet each time I caught a glimpse of Emily's behavior at home, I felt an odd dissonance that I couldn't quite put my finger on. It started with a simple observation one brisk morning. As I was leaving for work, I noticed an envelope resting on the kitchen counter, its paper pristine and printed in a neat, formal script. There was no return address, no explanation attached to it, just a single sheet of paper tucked away among the usual mail. I hesitated for a moment, wondering if it was meant for Emily or for me, but ultimately I set it aside without further thought. After all, our town was small, and stray mail was hardly uncommon. At breakfast that day, while Emily sipped her coffee and scrolled through her phone, I casually mentioned, "I saw an envelope on the counter this morning. Any idea what that might be?" She looked up briefly, a flicker of something crossing her eyes, and answered with a dismissive, "Oh, that? Just some invitation from a local event." Her tone was light enough, but there was a brief pause before she resumed her reading. I didn't press her further, choosing instead to chalk it up as one of those odd, isolated moments. Later that afternoon, as I passed by the town square on my drive back from work, I found myself slowing down. I remembered the solitary figure I'd seen the previous morning, a man in a worn jacket sitting on a bench, seemingly lost in thought. I watched for a moment, noting how he sat with a calm composure that set him apart from the usual early risers. His presence was quiet, yet it felt deliberate, as if he were waiting for someone. I couldn't help but wonder if there was a connection between that man and the envelope I'd seen. Again, I dismissed the thought, convinced that these were simply coincidences, artifacts of a small town where everyone's life often intersected in unexpected ways. Back at home that evening, I began to notice further small inconsistencies. While Emily prepared dinner, I saw her glance at her phone more frequently than usual. On more than one occasion, she excused herself to take a call, her voice dropping to a subdued murmur as if the conversation required privacy. I made a note of these moments in my mind, simple observations, Nothing dramatic enough to disrupt our quiet life, yet they added up slowly like pieces of a puzzle I wasn't sure I wanted to solve. After dinner, as I tidied up in the living room, I came across another curious detail. Emily's purse, usually tucked away in our bedroom closet, was left on the hallway table. Out of habit, I reached for it, only to find a set of receipts printed on flimsy paper. They were from a nearby diner, a place I rarely visited, and the timestamps on them didn't match any occasion I could recall. I folded the receipts carefully and placed them in my pocket. I told myself that perhaps Emily had gone out for a quick bite or met with someone from her volunteer group. After all, there were logical explanations for these small irregularities. The following morning, on my drive to work, I recalled the brief encounter in the park with that man in the worn jacket. I made a mental note of the area, deciding that if he appeared again, I'd pay closer attention. A few days later, while returning home in the early evening, I slowed as I passed by the park. There, seated on the same weathered bench beneath an old oak tree, was the same man. This time, however, he wasn't alone. Emily was there too. I couldn't see them clearly from my car, but I distinctly observed that she was talking with him. They stood close enough for him to lean in, his hand resting briefly on her arm. It wasn't a loud or boisterous interaction, just a quiet conversation carried out in low voices. I pulled back, my heart thumping a little faster, yet I forced myself to believe that it was nothing more than a friendly exchange. Once home, I made sure to act as if nothing had happened. The evening unfolded with its regular cadence. Dinner was set on the table, and Emily was in the kitchen, humming softly as she prepared our meal. I tried to focus on the familiar patterns, the clink of cutlery, the soft background chatter of the television, while an undercurrent of unease pulsed quietly in my thoughts. As the week wore on, the clues became a subtle part of my daily observations. There were moments when I'd catch Emily texting in a hurried manner, her fingers tapping rapidly on the screen before she stowed the phone away. I noticed that on some evenings she would step out to take a walk around the block, and when I asked, she would simply say she needed some fresh air. In our small town, it was common for neighbors to take walks at night, but the timing felt off. She would return later than usual, and I couldn't help but wonder where she had been. I began recording these observations in a small, leather-bound notebook that I kept hidden in my desk drawer. I wasn't one for wild accusations or dramatic theories. I was a practical man who believed in following the facts. Every unusual detail was noted: the extra envelope, the mismatched receipts, the whispered phone calls, and the evening walks that seemed to stretch longer than necessary. I wasn't trying to prove anything, merely documenting the discrepancies in our routine. At work, I tried to focus on the tangible tasks that occupied my days. Yet, every so often, the images of that park bench and the quiet exchanges replayed in my mind. The memory of Emily's gentle smile as she greeted me in the morning now carried a hint of something I couldn't decipher. Was it merely fatigue, or had her demeanor subtly shifted? I resolved to remain patient, to let the days bring clarity. One evening, as rain began to patter softly against the window, I returned home a bit earlier than usual. I intended to relax and catch up on some reading. In the dim light of the living room, I noticed that Emily's chair was empty, and a soft sound of muffled conversation drifted from the direction of the porch. I paused, unsure if I should investigate. Instead, I waited in silence, heart steady, as minutes passed slowly. When the sound ceased, I wondered if it was simply the wind or if it had been something more, a brief conversation with someone passing by. I decided it was best not to dwell on it. After all, small noises could easily be mistaken for the ordinary creaks and whispers of an old house settling in the night. That night, as I lay in bed, I replayed the day's small incidents in my mind. The envelope with no return address, the receipts from an unfamiliar diner, the extra time Emily spent on her phone, and her unexplained walks all formed a tapestry of subtle clues. I tried to rationalize each one, telling myself there were sensible explanations for every anomaly. Perhaps the envelope was a mistake in delivery, the receipts an errand for a friend, and the walks simply moments of solitude. Still, the cumulative effect of these quiet clues left a residue of uncertainty that I couldn't simply shake off. I resolved to keep my focus on the facts rather than jump to conclusions. I would wait and observe, recording each detail without letting emotion cloud my judgment. Routine was the backbone of my life, and I wasn't willing to let a series of minor oddities dismantle the order I'd built. Yet, deep down, I knew that sometimes the smallest discrepancies could hint at larger truths hidden beneath the surface. As the week came to a close, the small clues had woven themselves into the fabric of my daily existence. Every time I looked at the envelope or thought about that quiet figure in the park, a quiet unease stirred within me. But for now, life continued as it always had, a series of ordinary moments, each one seemingly insignificant on its own, yet together forming a pattern I was only beginning to decipher. I fell asleep each night with the hope that the morning's light would bring clarity, that the regularity of our routine would reaffirm that all was well. Instead, the quiet clues remained, subtle yet persistent reminders that not everything was as it appeared. And though I tried to dismiss them as mere coincidences, a part of me was now alert to the possibility that the life I thought I knew might be slowly changing in ways I couldn't yet understand. In the weeks that followed, the small oddities began to shift into something more persistent. My days continued with the steady demands of work, but the subtle clues at home gradually grew louder. Every routine activity, once the cornerstone of normalcy, now carried with it a hint of uncertainty that I couldn't ignore. One cool morning, I left for the construction site as usual, but on my drive I found my thoughts wandering. I recalled the envelope, the receipts, and especially the strange encounter in the park. There was one detail that had increasingly bothered me: Emily's unexplained departures. One day, while I was finishing up a late shift, I returned home to an empty living room. The clock showed 7:30 p.m., yet there was no sign of her. I searched quietly around the house, checking the kitchen and even the study where she sometimes worked. In the silence, I noticed that her purse had been left on the entryway table again. Inside, along with the usual items, there was a small note with a handwritten time, 8 p.m., and an address scribbled on the back. I folded the note carefully and set it aside, determined to piece it together later. That same evening, as dusk settled over our town, I drove by the park where I had first noticed the homeless man. This time, I was more deliberate. I parked a little further away and stepped out, watching the bench beneath the sprawling oak tree. The area was dimly lit by a single lamppost, and I kept to the shadows as I observed. For nearly 20 minutes, I saw no one. Then, just as the street began to empty, Emily emerged from the direction of the park. She walked briskly, clutching her purse, and her expression was calm, almost purposeful. I noted the exact time in my notebook. It was around 7:50 p.m., the same time indicated on the note I had found earlier. My pace quickened as I realized there might be a connection. I followed at a distance, careful not to be noticed. Emily walked down a narrow, tree-lined street that I rarely took. The buildings here were older, their facades weathered by time, and the streetlights cast long shadows on the pavement. She finally stopped in front of a modest building with a faded sign that read, Hope Center. I paused behind a parked car, trying to see inside through the large, grimy windows. The interior was dimly lit, and I could make out a few figures moving about, but I couldn't tell if Emily was with one of them. I decided to wait, my breath steady, watching for any sign that might explain her behavior. After what seemed like an eternity but was likely only a few minutes, Emily left the building. This time, she did not return directly home. Instead, she walked along another street, the one lined with a mix of small shops and a community bulletin board cluttered with flyers. I trailed her at a safe distance, making sure to remain out of sight. At one point, she paused in front of a food truck parked on the curb, a truck that served hearty sandwiches and coffee. She stood there for a few minutes, speaking with the truck's attendant, then purchased a sandwich and coffee. I saw her smile briefly as she handed over cash, and her eyes appeared relaxed. There was no trace of the tension I had noted on previous evenings. With her meal in hand, she resumed her walk. Back at home that night, I gathered the pieces of the day. I placed the note with the time and address next to the envelope I had seen weeks before. The address on the note was different from the Hope Center building I'd seen, though it was nearby. It appeared that Emily had several destinations on these outings. I couldn't shake the feeling that she was carefully crafting a schedule, one that I was not a part of. The next morning, over a quiet breakfast, I tried to broach the subject casually. "Emily, I noticed you mentioned a meeting at the Hope Center a few evenings ago. Is that part of your volunteer work?" I kept my tone neutral, not wanting to give away my growing suspicions. She hesitated for a split second before replying, "Yes, it's just a community outreach program. Nothing more." The answer was short and unadorned, with no elaboration. I simply nodded and sipped my coffee, but the silence that followed felt heavy. Over the subsequent days, I observed more details that didn't fit into our routine. On one occasion, while reviewing some paperwork at my desk, I found a new sticker on my car's windshield, an emblem that I hadn't seen before. It was a simple logo featuring an olive branch and a single word, "Hope." I hadn't seen this symbol anywhere around town until now, and the coincidence was too pointed to ignore. I thought back to the building outside the Hope Center and wondered if it was connected somehow. I began to compile my observations more meticulously in my hidden notebook. Each entry was factual: time, location, what I saw. I was careful not to let emotion seep into my notes. The goal was to build a clear picture of the pattern emerging in our daily lives, a record of the discrepancies that had gradually undermined the stability I once took for granted. Late one evening, as rain dripped steadily against the windows, I decided to check Emily's work schedule for the community center. I logged into her shared calendar on our computer, an account we both used for household planning, and noticed several new entries that I hadn't seen before. One of them was titled, "Meeting with Community Volunteer," with no further details, scheduled for 8 p.m. on a Friday. The timing matched the note I had found, and the location, though not specified, seemed to be in the same part of town where I had observed her. I printed out the calendar page and added it to my collection of clues. There was no overt sign of any scandalous affair, no passionate texts or overheard arguments. Instead, everything was measured, like the ticking of a clock. Emily's interactions, her timely exits, and the methodical way she maintained her routine during the day all suggested a deliberate effort to compartmentalize parts of her life. I reviewed my notes that night, my eyes tracing over the exact times and locations. I wasn't jumping to conclusions yet, I was simply gathering the facts. One particular entry in my notebook stood out: the day I saw her talking to the homeless man on the park bench. I had written down his appearance in careful detail: his worn jacket, his unkempt hair, the way he seemed to be waiting for someone. I noted that on that day, his presence was the only deviation from the expected faces in our town's morning routine. Now, combined with the note and the new schedule entry, the pieces began to suggest that there was a part of Emily's life I knew nothing about. I decided that the next step was to confirm these suspicions without alerting her. I resolved to be even more vigilant in the coming days. I started parking my car in different locations near the areas where she was seen, hoping to observe her movements more directly. I would catch brief glimpses of her entering a building or meeting with a familiar face whose identity I had yet to decipher. Every observation was catalogued with the same precision as before. In this period of quiet investigation, the ordinary and the extraordinary began to blur. My routine at the construction site continued unaffected by the growing discrepancies at home. I would review blueprints and schedule inspections while an undercurrent of uncertainty tugged at my mind during the quiet moments. I focused on the tangible details of my work, knowing that the truth, whatever it might be, would eventually reveal itself through the steady accumulation of facts. That night, as I locked the door to our home, I paused and looked back through the window. The living room lights were dim, and I couldn't see Emily. The silence was profound. I turned away and stepped into my car, resolved to keep a clear head. In the dark of the parking lot, the envelope, the note, the calendar entry, all these items formed a pattern I could no longer dismiss as mere coincidences. I had no proof of anything scandalous, but the discrepancies were too consistent to ignore. As I drove home later, the rain washing over the windshield, I felt the weight of the unknown pressing in on me. Every quiet clue was a small piece of a larger puzzle, a puzzle that was gradually taking shape and hinting at a reality that I had never anticipated. The methodical nature of Emily's departures, the precise timings, the locations, all of it pointed to a secret life, hidden behind the veneer of everyday routine. I resolved that tomorrow I would be even more careful, to observe without being seen, to note every detail. The truth was out there, woven into the fabric of our ordinary days, and I was determined to piece it together one quiet, relentless clue at a time. That rainy evening, I knew I had reached the point of no return. After weeks of discreet observations and careful note-taking, every small discrepancy had led to the inevitable conclusion: Emily was living a double life. Tonight, I would confront the truth head-on. I returned home from work early, my mind set on gathering the final pieces of evidence. The front door was locked, but as I opened it, I immediately sensed something was off. The living room lights were dimmer than usual, and a low murmur of conversation drifted from the hallway. I paused at the threshold, my eyes scanning for the source of the sound. In the kitchen, I found Emily. She stood by the counter, her back turned, speaking softly into her phone. The tone was calm, measured, a stark contrast to the hurried whispers I had overheard in previous days. I watched silently, feeling the weight of every documented detail I had collected. On the counter lay the familiar envelope and a folded note, evidence of her carefully orchestrated departures. My heart remained steady as I stepped forward. "Emily," I said, my voice clear and even. She froze. Slowly, she turned around, and for a moment, there was only silence. The low hum of the refrigerator filled the pause between us. "Ben," she replied, her tone flat and devoid of the warmth that once marked our interactions. I gestured for her to sit at the small kitchen table. I laid out the evidence before her, copies of the calendar entries, the note with the time and address, the receipts from the unfamiliar diner, and the photograph I had taken discreetly near the park bench. Every piece was there, arranged in an orderly fashion, each detail a silent witness to the growing discrepancies in our daily life. "Explain this," I said, pointing to the note. "Who are you meeting at these locations, and why have you been leaving without telling me?" Emily's eyes flickered, and she took a measured breath. For a long moment, she said nothing. Finally, she spoke in a low, matter-of-fact tone. "It's not a matter of secrecy or drama, Benjamin. I met someone who isn't part of our usual life. His name is Sam." I nodded slowly, my face remaining impassive. "Sam," I repeated. "And how long has this been going on?" She hesitated, then said, "For several weeks. It started innocently enough. A conversation in the park, a shared lunch near the community center. I didn't plan it, it just happened." Her words were blunt, as if reciting facts from a file rather than recounting emotions. I asked, "Why him? Why someone who comes from a completely different world?" Emily's gaze shifted to the envelope, and she replied, "I was tired of the routine, Ben. I needed something raw, something real. You never knew what was behind your door. I had no idea what lay behind mine either until it was too late." There was no dramatic outburst, no tearful apology. It was simply an explanation, stripped of any pretense. The conversation continued in this measured manner. I questioned her about the precise timings, the locations, and the manner in which she had maintained her daily schedule. Every answer was factual, rehearsed even, as if she had prepared for this moment. "I set aside time for these meetings so that nothing would interfere with our life," she said. "I didn't want to hurt you or disrupt our routine. I just needed something different." I listened carefully, my mind cataloging every word. I had prepared for many possibilities, and while the truth was painful, it was not wrapped in theatrical passion. It was simply a deviation from the routine I had come to trust. "And the meetings at the Hope Center?" I pressed. "What was their purpose?" "Just conversations," she replied. "There was a community project, and I was part of it. Sam was involved in the outreach. It started as volunteer work, and then it grew into something personal. I kept it separate from our life because I thought it would remain just that, a personal connection that didn't affect our everyday routine." I set down the note. "You chose not to tell me," I stated plainly. "I have a record of every time you left the house, every time you returned with explanations that never quite added up." My voice was steady, neither angry nor sorrowful, just factual. There was a pause as she regarded me, her face impassive. Finally, she said, "I understand that you have every right to be upset. I made a choice. I didn't mean for it to be this way. I thought I could compartmentalize my life." Her words were simple, matter-of-fact, without any flourish. I took a deep breath. We built a life based on routine and trust, Emily. I kept my part of the bargain. I expected honesty. I laid out the next steps. I need time to process this, and I need to figure out what to do next. For now, I want you to stay in your room. We'll talk again once I have sorted out the details. Without another word, she nodded and moved to the bedroom. I remained in the kitchen, the evidence spread out before me like a silent indictment. The finality of the moment settled in with each measured detail. There was no moment of explosive anger, just the quiet unraveling of a shared life that had been meticulously documented over weeks of silent observation. I spent the rest of the evening organizing the papers and preparing a list of the practical steps I needed to take, securing our finances, arranging for temporary accommodation, and planning for the inevitable conversations with friends and family. Each action was deliberate, no room for dramatics, just the cold efficiency of someone dealing with a disruption of routine. Late that night, after Emily had gone to sleep, I sat alone at my desk. I reviewed my notes one last time, every detail reaffirming what I now knew. I felt neither triumphant nor defeated, only resolute. The truth had been laid out plainly, without the embellishments of emotion, and I was now left with the task of rebuilding a life that had been quietly altered by a series of small, deliberate choices. In the early hours of the morning, I packed a bag and left the house. I drove without looking back, my focus on the road ahead and the practical steps I needed to take to reclaim my own life. The betrayal was complete, and while the shock had not come in a blaze of drama, it was as real and as final as any upheaval could be. The unraveling was over. I had seen the truth in the small clues, in the methodical departure from our routine, and now I was moving forward, step by measured step, into a future defined not by hidden secrets, but by the clarity of an unvarnished reality. And I had just stepped into a game that was much, much bigger than I ever realized. And that's the end of today's story. If you enjoyed this journey, please give this video a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more incredible stories like this one. Got thoughts or experiences you'd like to share? Drop them in the comments. I'd love to hear from you. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care.